All right, let's begin here. President Cyril Ramaphosa will address the nation at 8 p.m. on developments in the country's fight against COVID-19.
So we do have a hint what could come. Speaking last month, Ramaphosa announced government's intention to lift the national state of disaster that came into effect a little over 2 years ago. The state of disaster was declared after the country recorded its first COVID-19 case in March 2020. South Africans have been invited to comment on proposed COVID-19 draft regulations before the 16th of this month. All right, so the President addressed the nation tonight to discuss. We're joined by Alex van den Heever, adjunct professor at the Wits School of Governance. Prof, thank you for being with us as always. So the Minister of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs also said that the President would announce the end of a state of disaster. Do you think tonight will just be the follow-through?
I think so. I think they're very keen to end this particular arrangement now. So the real question becomes what they're replacing it with, because I think there's a reluctance to leave a complete vacuum while we still haven't got a conclusion to this particular pandemic, and there's a risk of other infectious diseases impacting. So the question really is, what does the alternative regime look like? And I think there a concern would be if too much power ends up being concentrated in the hands of the Minister of Health. And so the question is, what's the governance of any framework that could implement restrictions and limit people's activities?
Shouldn't there be some checks if there's not a state of disaster? So yes, a lot of these provisions can be moved to the health ministry, but surely there are limits once you move out of the state of disaster.
I think there should be. What you would want is to have, if there is something that is contained in the Health Act, you would want to have some sort of escalation process. So if you're in an effective disaster situation in relation to an infectious disease, that certain governance structures kick in before certain decisions can be made. Alternatively, you have a more dilute set of capabilities put in the Health Act and rely on reinstituting the Disaster Management Act if it's required. There is also the issue of the social relief of distress grants, which were created in terms of regulation to the Disaster Management Act, and they also have to be transferred to the Social Assistance Act. So I think that the question now is, are both sets of regulations close to finality so that they can actually announce the end?
All right, and you've raised this before, that the payment of the 350 Rand grants is important, and that was introduced under a state of disaster. What sort of arrangement can there be? And it sounds like it's got to be a quick arrangement at that.
Well, I think that they had published draft regulations, the Department of Social Development, and but it's moved from also a temporary arrangement to a more permanent framework, one in which there might be more validation checks on people who access the grant. So there would be expected to be more detail in those regulations, but again, it does depend on the finality there. But if they are not perfect, there's no catastrophe, because you can modify regulations down the line and amend any regulations. So I think that it won't necessarily be a quick and dirty. There would probably be more consideration than there was for the initial set of regulations. But we'll probably see amendments over the next year or so in any case.
All right, but at least they will continue to get paid. Prof, you said that government is keen to come out of this situation. Government has been criticised for holding on for too long, and I'd love your comment. The minister, the Cooperative Governance Minister, suggested that the Disaster Management Centre may have played a part here, saying that this no longer counted as a disaster. So do you believe that this is changing because the pressure is on right now?
Yeah, so I think that because of the vaccination, two things, vaccinations and the level of natural infection has actually impacted on immunity in South Africa generally. So that even though it's very probable that we're going to see many waves from now on, and that the virus will be with us, but it's not necessarily going to have a very severe impact. So at this point, the need to maintain restrictions and to through the Disaster Management Act, it has no real merit at this point. And but they still need to be cautious with the virus. Individuals still need to remain cautious, even though at a population level the risk has gone down. But for many individuals, it might still remain very high if they weren't infected before and if they didn't get vaccinated. They're still at risk. But it's going to end up shifting a lot more to the individual to manage their risk rather than for government to do it.
What about the regulations that have caused concern, because some have argued it infringes on our fundamental rights, for example, the freedom to movement? So a curfew has been one of the contentious issues, suspending the sale of alcohol and other things. Could things like that move to health, or do you think that wouldn't be possible? So we are actually seeing the end of curfews, we're seeing the end of any prohibition on alcohol sales unless the state of disaster is reintroduced down the line.
Yeah, I think that it would be incredibly problematic to allow a Minister of Health to introduce national curfews and general prohibitions on the sale of alcohol, for instance. These really go way beyond the brief of the Minister of Health because of the knock-on effects. But when you look at those kind of restrictions, I mean, we had a lot of experience of them. The question is one of efficacy. Did they actually make a difference? And I think a lot of them didn't make a lot of difference. So the question was, where are the restrictions merited? And if they are merited, then to restrict somebody's movement is appropriate if it works. But if it doesn't work, then the law itself and the restriction itself is inappropriate and shouldn't be applied. So I think that we've got to evaluate these measures very carefully. Sometimes they would be appropriate, but only if they work, not if they don't work.
Yeah. Well, very quickly, your evaluation of masks, because remember, according to the regulations, according to what the President said last time, we still need to wear masks indoors. And the 30 days after the state of disaster, once that lapses, the Minister said that the regulations no longer count. So do you think this masking up the regulations will then move into health around those sorts of things?
Yeah, so again, mask wearing generally is required around a sort of a wider epidemic and pandemic, whereas normally the regulations for managing a pandemic would be around testing, tracing, contact tracing, and confinement. So I think that mask wearing might go beyond that requirement and rather should be introduced through a Disaster Management Act rather than through the Ministry of Health. So it's quite likely that the mask wearing requirements will disappear with the end of the Disaster Management Act.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that. And we're looking ahead to the President addressing the nation tonight around our response to COVID-19. That was Alex van den Heever, adjunct professor at the Wits School of Governance.
All right, let's stay then with this particular story and head to the Union Buildings, where we find our political editor, Mzwandile Mbeje, who is standing by for us. Mzwai, we saw the briefing last week by the Cocta Minister, which signaled the possible end to the state of disaster, but of course talking about those transitional measures that need to be put in place. Are we likely to see an end to the state of disaster tonight?
Oh, well, a very good evening to you, Bong and Francis there. Clearly, from what has been communicated in the past by the President himself and, of course, the Minister, so they were already signaling that the days for the state of disaster as we know it are coming to an end. But, of course, measures that will make sure that we are still safe, I guess, will still be in place. And you'd remember that there was a document basically to say people need to comment insofar as what needs to be done. So clearly, having read and seen and looked at how the trajectory of the disease is going, I get a sense that perhaps that's what the President is going to announce. If not happening today, he probably will say when the time for it lapses, so it may not be renewed. Because I think he has been at pains, Bongiwe, to say this is the virus that we are going to live with for the longest of times by the look of things. So we then have to find ways to live with it. And of course, he will speak about the issue of ramping up vaccination. You know that people tend to be very slow now these days. And obviously, in the midst of some either fake news or conspiracy theories, that is what he also will want to dispel. But clearly, from your original question, I think we are coming to the end, really, of the state of disaster. It may not happen today, or rather tonight, but I suspect when it lapses, I think on the 15th or on the 14th of this month, it may not be renewed. But of course, we'll wait in the next 45 minutes. I think the President will be able to share that with us.
And one of the key things, of course, you talk about is vaccination, but at the same time, there's lots of concern around ending the state of disaster abruptly, because this is what the Cocta Minister said repeatedly last week. And there are some such concerns around the social relief of distress grant that was received by some South Africans, that if it ends abruptly, it may just be disastrous. Mzwandile.
Oh, yes. I think we also must bear in mind, Bongi, that the President has already announced that the relief grant will run until March next year. So it really will defy logic if then the President were to then come with a decision that will end that abruptly. So it will call into question into why he would have to announce something that he was going to end within months. So clearly the measures that have been put in place, and I think several ministers as well have indicated that there would be measures that would be put in place to ensure that the social relief grant still continues, because there has been a clear need that some people definitely need it. So those are the measures that we expect the President to really outline tonight as he addresses the issue of COVID-19. But of course, the fact of the matter is that the economy is showing some green shoots. That's what he likes to say. And then I think he would want to then assist it to really get back. Just 2 weeks ago, he held an investment conference where it's really, really promising. We saw a couple of days ago when SARS indicated how much it's been able to collect. So all those things put together, Bongiwe. So I think the President would want to say, given that our economy is already fighting back, let's also ease these restrictions to give it even more oomph and power. But whilst doing that, we must also make sure that those measures that are meant to keep us safe, those measures that are meant to bring relief are still in place. So what is it that they've done is exactly what's going to be communicated tonight.
And definitely, Mzwandile, as you even talk about, those green shoots that the President talks about, there was even, some positive news, as others were saying, when Moody's revised our outlook. But all of these things, as we talk, are happening against the juxtaposition of what you mentioned even earlier on, which is around vaccination. And that is, of course, is going to be critical when it comes to how you open up various industries, because some of these regulations say that indoors you have to, if you are exceeding the capacity, you must produce a vaccine certificate or a PCR test. That is also going to be quite critical when opening the economy, is it not?
Certainly, and you will hear him say more about vaccine and the need to really vaccinate, because clearly the available evidence at hand is that to beat or rather to be able to live with this virus is to be vaccinated, so that if it catches you, at least you have less chances of severe illness or even death. So that is the message I think he would want also to push. Particularly, Bongi, remember in the past few weeks, there's been so many stories around the vaccine, in fact, when it relates to the issue of the boosters. And I think he would also want to dispel that. And if you look at the slow pace of taking the vaccine as well, so that will be a bit of concern. But I guess if he is able to then say some of the measures are open, and then these are the things to do, perhaps people will be able to respond positively, because, I mean, at the end of the day, Bongiwe, at some point, life has to go back to normalcy. Yes, the normalcy may not be the one that we used to know, but of course, at least some semblance of normalcy is certainly required.
Definitely, Mzwai, as some people are even saying that they no longer want to be wearing masks. So it will be interesting to see how that particular issue plays itself out. But we'll leave it there with you for now as you continue then to wait for that address at 8 p.m. That's our political editor, Mzwandile Mbeje. And remember, at 8 p.m. we will be bringing you that address by President Cyril Ramaphosa.